For nearly 3 years, the war in Ukraine had settled into a pattern that military analysts described with one suffocating word: attrition. Every week, maps would shift by fractions of a kilometer. Every week, the numbers would mount: the dead, the displaced, the destroyed. The conflict had become, in the eyes of many observers, a slow-motion catastrophe with no decisive turning points left to offer. Russia had the numbers, Russia had the weight. And by the autumn of 2025, Russia appeared, to all outward appearances, to be winning. Then, in December of that year, something happened that shattered that narrative with the cold precision of a surgical strike. To understand what Ukraine pulled off in the winter of 2025, you have to understand what came before it. Throughout the year, Russian forces had been advancing, slowly, brutally, expensively, but advancing nonetheless. By Russia's own tallies, Moscow claimed to have captured nearly 5,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025 alone. Since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, Russia had seized approximately 29,000 additional square miles, equivalent to roughly 12% of Ukraine's territory. The front was moving. Not in the sweeping armored charges that defined Cold War doctrine, but in something more insidious: a grinding, methodical consumption of Ukrainian defenses, village by village, trench line by trench line. Russia had adapted effectively to drone and artillery-heavy warfare over the course of 2025, shifting toward small unit operations supported by unmanned systems. This was the new face of mechanized warfare, not the thundering tank columns of Kursk or the Normandy beaches, but swarms of cheap, expendable drones guiding teams of infantry in dispersed formations, moving through fog and darkness, exploiting the gaps in Ukraine's increasingly thin defensive lines. A Ukrainian commander near Pokrovsk described the battlefield as a series of mostly hidden, isolated, and small outposts where infantry try to hold ground covertly without being spotted by enemy drones. The modern front line had become invisible, terrifying, and almost impossible to hold with conventional methods. Ukraine's defensive capacity continued to erode due to shortages of manpower and equipment, which gave Russia local opportunities to push the front forward. The critical city of Pokrovsk, a logistical artery in the Donetsk region described as a center of defense whose fall analysts warned could unravel the entire eastern front line, had come under relentless Russian pressure for more than a year. By December 2025, Pokrovsk was nearly entirely in Russian control. In the south, Russian forces had torn open the Zaporizhzhia front. In September, Russian forces began a relatively rapid advance in the farmlands to the east of Zaporizhzhia, advancing up to 6 miles in places, according to Ukrainian military officials, as territorial defense units that had been holding the area for 2 years crumbled under sudden and intense offensive pressure. The Kremlin's information machine roared triumphantly. State media declared inevitable victory. Putin's generals lined up to present their battlefield reports like courtiers presenting gifts to an emperor. Then came Kupiansk, and the lie came apart. Kupiansk is a town in the northeastern Kharkiv region that sits astride a critical convergence of roads and the Oskil River. With a pre-war population of roughly 26,600 people, it is not a metropolis, but its strategic value is enormous. Control of Kupiansk grants access to deeper positions in Kharkiv Oblast and opens corridors toward northern Donetsk. Russia had understood this since 2022, when Ukrainian forces liberated the city in one of the most stunning counteroffensive operations of the entire war. 3 years later, Moscow was determined to take it back. Throughout the summer and autumn of 2025, Russia poured men and material into the Kupiansk direction. By mid-October, British Ministry of Defense assessments noted Russian forces had seized most of the high-rise buildings in northern Kupiansk. By late October and early November, Russian infiltration had reached the southern districts. By 9 November, Russian forces had infiltrated southwestern Kupiansk, occupying buildings and positions near the H-26 highway connecting Kupiansk to Kharkiv. It looked from the outside like a city on the verge of falling. On November 20th, 2025, Russia's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, stood before Vladimir Putin in a nationally televised meeting and announced that Kupiansk had been fully captured. Putin nodded. Awards were discussed. During a heavily scripted meeting with Putin, Russian military leaders had prematurely boasted that their forces had completely captured Kupiansk. The Kremlin's cognitive warfare machine was in full operation, projecting momentum, projecting inevitability, trying to drag Ukraine and its Western partners toward a negotiating table where Russia held all the leverage. But on the ground, reality was already diverging sharply from the stage-managed performance in Moscow. On 16th November, Ukrainian forces had begun a carefully prepared multi-week counterattack operation in the Kupiansk sector. It did not announce itself. It did not come in waves of armor. It came in silence with precision, exploiting exactly the vulnerability that Russia's own tactical doctrine had created. By surging forward in small infiltration teams and outrunning their logistics, Russian units in Kupiansk had advanced faster than they could consolidate. They held buildings, they held city blocks. But they were exposed, dependent on thin supply lines, and surrounded on multiple axes by Ukrainian forces that had spent weeks mapping their positions. Ukrainian forces conducted a tactical counterattack in the Kupiansk direction, liberating Kindrashivka, Radkivka, Myrov, and areas in northern Kupiansk, breaking through to the Oskil River and reportedly encircling roughly 200 Russian troops in the city. The speed of the move was surgical. Ukrainian units didn't attempt to frontally assault fortified Russian positions inside the urban core. They went around them, cutting off their lines of communication, severing their supply routes, and leaving the Russian forces inside the city stranded in a pocket with no way out and no reinforcement coming. A Ukrainian commander described the moment with measured satisfaction. Today, we can say that the Russians in the city are completely cut off. For a long time, they couldn't understand what was happening, but now they know they are surrounded. The reaction in Moscow was immediate and revealing. On Telegram, Russian military bloggers lambasted the deceitful practice within the Russian military of reporting advances before they have actually been made. One prominent pro-Kremlin analyst publicly acknowledged that the military command was acting as a witness to a lie. Pro-war Russian ultranationalist mill bloggers publicly acknowledged that the Russian military command's claims were exaggerated, and several noted that there was no evidence to support Gerasimov's claim that Russian forces were operating within critical sectors of the Zaporizhzhia region. The cracks in the Kremlin's information architecture were showing, not just to outside analysts, but to Russia's own war fever nationalist base. On December 12, 2025, President Volodymyr Zelensky did something that required not only political courage, but physical courage of an extraordinary kind. He traveled to Kupiansk. He stood in front of a bullet-riddled road sign bearing the city's name, well within range of Russian drones and artillery, and recorded a short video. The Russians kept going on about Kupiansk, he said. The reality speaks for itself. It was one of the most precise acts of political demolition of the entire war. Putin's generals had declared the city captured on live television 22 days earlier. Here was the Ukrainian president, alive, standing at its entrance, with Ukrainian soldiers surrounding him and Russian forces surrounded inside it. Between December 11th and December 25th, Ukrainian forces stabilized control over the town of Kupiansk and retook at least 183 square kilometers, pushing Russian forces out of several settlements near the town. For context, Russia had been averaging territorial gains of roughly 44 square miles per week across the entire front line in 2025. Ukraine, in 2 weeks in a single sector, had reversed more than 3 months of Russian effort and effectively negated one of Moscow's most loudly proclaimed battlefield victories of the year. By mid-December, Ukrainian forces controlled approximately 70% of Kupiansk city. What made this possible was not a sudden infusion of Western weapons, not a new army corps arriving from the rear. It was something more subtle and, in a way, more significant: the exploitation of structural weaknesses built into Russia's own offensive doctrine. Russian forces currently maintain a rate of incoming personnel sufficient to replace losses, but have been unable to build large enough reserves to flood a sector of the front without redeploying personnel from other areas. When Russia concentrates forces on one breakthrough axis, it thins the flanks. It always has. Ukraine had learned to watch for it, to wait, and then to strike with everything available. The requirement to draw reserves from some sectors of the line to focus on operationally significant undertakings often leaves Russia's flanks undermanned in ways that create vulnerabilities, sometimes allowing Ukrainian forces to counterattack and retake land. The Kupiansk operation did not occur in isolation. Even as Ukraine mounted its counterattack in the northeast, simultaneous Ukrainian pressure was being applied in the Pokrovsk direction. Ukraine liberated a significant portion of the Russian penetration in the Dobropilya direction, northwest of Pokrovsk, during Russia's offensive on Pokrovsk in early November. Ukrainian unmanned systems forces were simultaneously conducting deep strikes. Between December 30 and 31, Ukrainian forces struck a Russian oil depot in occupied Luhansk Oblast, roughly 124 kilometers from the front line, alongside strikes on multiple Russian military positions and drone units in occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia Oblasts in Crimea. This was not a single breakthrough. It was a coordinated, multi-axis pressure campaign designed to force Russian commanders to make impossible choices about where to send reserves. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky, stated that Ukrainian forces were prioritizing counterattacks in areas where Russian forces were weakest. The enemy is currently playing by our rules. It is forced to adjust and concentrate its efforts where we are advancing. This is the doctrine of a force that cannot match its opponent in raw numbers but can still outthink it. It is the logic of asymmetric warfare applied at an operational level, not simply raiding and retreating, but forcing a larger, slower enemy into reactive posture and extracting maximum strategic return from each committed action. But Ukrainian counterattacks have reportedly disrupted Russian efforts to set conditions for a spring-summer 2026 offensive and will force the Russians first to fight to establish stable defensive positions before starting the fight to regain lost ground. This is the most consequential long-term implication of what happened at Kupiansk. Russia entered 2026 not building momentum toward a decisive spring campaign, but scrambling to reconsolidate positions it had prematurely declared secured. Every week spent patching that defensive hole is a week not spent preparing the next offensive. Every soldier sent back into the Oskil River bend to recapture what was already supposedly captured is a soldier not available for the push toward Dnipro or Zaporizhia. The strategic cost of Kupiansk may be far larger than its geographic footprint suggests. Putin's invasion of Ukraine enters its fifth year with Russia having failed to achieve any of its original war aims and facing setbacks on the battlefield amid mounting casualties. The facts beneath the propaganda are staggering. Ukraine estimates that Russia has sustained more than 790,000 killed or injured since the invasion began, with roughly 30,000 Russian troops killed per month as of late 2025. Russia's economy, after weathering the first 3 years of war relatively well, slowed significantly in 2025, with its treasury, central bank, and energy corporations running short of cash and leading to cuts in defense spending. The Russian military machine is running. It is still dangerous. It is still advancing in multiple sectors, but it is not advancing the way an army on the verge of victory advances. It is advancing the way an army in deep trouble advances, expensively, brutally, and with diminishing returns against a defender that refuses to collapse. The story of Kupiansk is not ultimately a story about a single city in northeastern Ukraine. It is a story about the difference between declared reality and actual reality. It is a story about a Kremlin that needed Kupiansk to be a victory so badly that it announced that victory before securing it, and paid a severe price when Ukraine turned that lie into a trap. It is a story about a Ukrainian military that, after nearly 4 years of being outgunned, outmanned, and outlasted, still possesses the strategic creativity, the tactical discipline, and the sheer stubborn will to make its opponent bleed for every meter of ground. A pro-Kremlin military blogger with nearly 3 million Telegram subscribers expressed doubt over whether Russian forces can reverse the unfavorable battlefield situation in coming months, complaining about rather successful Ukrainian counterattacks. When the war's most fervent Russian supporters begin asking those questions, the answer begins to take shape. The front line in Ukraine is not static. It has never been static. It breathes and contracts and ruptures and seals. What changed at Kupiansk in the winter of 2025 was something deeper, a demonstration that the war's supposedly inevitable trajectory can still be interrupted, redirected, and reversed. Russia may still have more men and more shells, but Ukraine still has something that no logistics chain can supply: the will to keep fighting, the intelligence to find the gap, and the nerve to drive through it.